Are you a crappy partner, crappy wife, crappy husband, crappy mate? This podcast is for you. Give yourself the gift of self-awareness. Learn new skills. Take the time to assess your partnership, marriage, relationship, etc. So how are we going to do this? Start by taking the Crappy Mate quiz. The quiz can be found on our website, www.crappymate.com, on Pinterest, Crappy Mate, Instagram and Facebook, Crappy Mate Podcast. We will dedicate episodes to discussing the quiz topics. In further episodes, we will be exploring common problems, speed bumps that occur in relationships. Also, we will introduce time-tested skills and helpful hints to enhance your relationship, and we invite you, our listeners, to contribute your thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding relationships. Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. I'm Dr. Richard Vance Barnes, MD. I'm a board-certified general psychiatrist with 25 plus years in psychiatry. I have treated patients in a variety of settings, both inpatient units, outpatient units, partial hospitalization units, as well as detoxification programs and rehabilitation programs. And I've had a private practice for many, many years.
And I'm Barbara Quaid, a marriage and family therapist. I also have over 25 years experience working with families, individuals, and couples. And my life as a therapist has been both humbling and joyful. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy, and as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
The Crappy Mate podcast was developed out of hearing years and years of stories and accounts from patients in therapy about their mates and themselves actually being crappy mates and poorly behaving within the relationship. And so this concept was then developed into a podcast of how can we help people to actually improve upon their relationships.
And so in order to do this, we developed a quiz. And the quiz, we really thought about some concepts that we thought were important in a relationship. And so the Crappy Mate quiz ended up being a 10-question self-scoring assessment that can be found on our Facebook page. And our Facebook page is aptly named the Crappy Mate Podcast. And along with the quiz, you will find a glossary with the terms we used both in the podcast and on the quiz. And this is so we can all be on the same page. Now, to score the quiz, you will read each question carefully and then ask yourself, do I do this almost always, sometimes, or almost never? And when we thought about this, the scoring is like this. Almost always is worth 3 points, sometimes 2 points, and almost never 1 point. So once you have your total points, you add them up. And a score of 10 to 17 clearly indicates that one needs improvement. A score of 17 to 24, one has a degree of awareness, but improvement can still be beneficial. And a score of 24 to 30, one is aware, insightful, and acting in a positive manner as it pertains to the relationship.
Well, welcome to the Crappy Mate podcast. Today we are talking about living with a partner with mental illness and what that looks like and what can we do to actually improve that situation. So let me put this out to you, Barbara. First off, what is mental illness?
So that's a good question because I think it's any number of conditions that would affect mood, thinking, and or behavior, and maybe all three of those.
So when I think about mental illness as a psychiatrist, my mind goes to the more difficult conditions to treat, as well as the conditions that may involve hospitalization. And I'm thinking of conditions like severe major depression, perhaps some of the eating disorders and schizophrenia and some of the psychotic conditions. However, there are many, many people, I'm sure, in America and around the world that do have a mental illness and yet have not been identified as having one.
I think when we look at family situations, I do a genogram, which is really looking at family situations and who your parents are and your grandparents. And I always ask about questions like, is there any mental illness in your family? And people will say, well, I think my grandmother was, or I think my grandfather did, but we never knew. We didn't have a diagnosis. And I was just looking at a statistic that said 26% of adult Americans suffer from some sort of mental illness.
That is a pretty high percentage. And I would say, from my own clinical experience, that percentage is low, actually. And I think that it's because we can come and go in the severity of our condition. And so for a period of time, people may be super depressed. They may have thoughts of suicidality. And then there are other times when they may even just have a low-level form of depression, which would be a dysthymia, a low level of depression that would last for about 2 years. And I would have to say probably everyone who's ever lived in America may have had that at some point in their lives. However, and certainly by way of COVID, I think that we all had a minor depression, or maybe not so minor. So I think it's important to realize and recognize the fact that it's a variation on the theme in terms of the conditions that may be considered mental illness, but that may come to attention as being a problem. And there are many of us that are living that maybe it never comes to the surface. Maybe it never comes to be known by anyone else, and maybe not even by the individual.
Yes, I think it's on a continuum, when you think about mental illness. And I think that 26% that I talked about earlier, that's probably people who are diagnosed, who actually have gone to a mental health professional and received a diagnosis and or medication. So you're right. People are living in their households with their families in an undiagnosed state.
Yes, and I think that for a lot of people in this situation, and I can think of several of my patients that I do have that live with partners that have mental illness and difficulties with their behaviors and their actions and their thoughts. I can think about how difficult it is for these patients of mine, and they talk about it. They talk about some of the feelings that they have living with someone who has some mental illness. And I think that empathy comes to mind as a way of managing the frustrations and sometimes the anger and the disappointments that people are feeling in regards to living with someone who is suffering. So I think empathy plays a key role, a key aspect in allowing us to live with a partner who is living themselves with mental illness.
Well, and I think with empathy, what that means is we have to learn about or inform ourselves about our partner's mental illness, because otherwise we can be just frustrated with behaviors and the moods, and especially the behaviors probably. And so it really behooves us to learn about our partner's mental illness, find out what it's about, find out what the symptoms are, and therefore be able to be more empathetic to your partner.
I think you make a really, really significant and valid point in terms of finding out the background, because when you do find the background and you learn about, for instance, the trauma history, well, it almost emotionally disarms you in terms of the anger or the frustration or the disappointments that you have, because you reach a level of just great understanding, and hopefully along with that understanding comes great empathy. And I had to do this several times in my own life, and I had to do this also in therapy with patients, and because certain behaviors can be seen as being disturbing to others. But I'm often reminded that people will defend themselves. They will act in a certain way based on their need to. And what I mean by that is they may have had a significant abuse history or a history of abandonment, and so that they're going to act in a certain way that may be irritating to some, but it's understanding why they are performing in that way because of their background.
I can give you a really good example of that. Years ago, I had a supervisee that I was supervising, and he was a man in his mid-70s. He had been trained as a PhD in engineering and then decided he wanted to give back to the community and became a therapist. Now, his background is this. He was from Germany, and during the war, he was one of those children. At age 7, he was taken to Great Britain to be kept safe. He was a Jewish little boy, and he was in the kinder trains that took the kids to the countryside. So he was separated from his parents for a number of years. Didn't know what was happening with his parents, didn't know where they were, if they were safe, none of that. Now, the way this manifests, when I would see him, if I was 5 minutes late, he would get very upset. It was unusual how upset he would be because he had this ongoing fear of abandonment.
Now, I would say, as a therapist, I'm sure you would recall his background every time you would see him, and you would also anticipate that his disappointments will center upon your availability and whether or not you are going to be consistent in terms of being and working with him.
Yes, all of that came into play because, first of all, I knew about this, so I didn't want to disappoint him. And secondly, I knew that he would be distressed if I wasn't there on time. But I knew him, and I knew that this was a defense. And knowing his history just made me feel, well, I can deal with this.
I think that's beautiful. And I think that, partners have to do that with their mates, their spouses, and their loved ones. They have to do this and able to not see them as having almost a purposeful reason for acting in a certain way. And they're not purposely acting that way. In most cases, it's because of their illness. And so I think that understanding the background and appreciating that allows for us to be more gentle with people and to be more open. But there's something about that as well, in as much as you still have to have boundaries, right? Because we can be overrun and we can identify almost too much with a partner's condition, a way of being, a certain mood state. And so we can be pulled into that as well, and I think begin to experience some of the feelings that the partner feels as well.
Okay, so just with that, and with that supervisee that I was speaking about, the way I set boundaries with him is I would say, I'm going to try to be on time, but of course there's going to sometimes be circumstances where I can't be on time. Just know that I'm going to be there, and it's not personal. I'm not doing this to punish you or to hurt you, but I will be there in time. And then just having that out there, speaking about it, and saying, I'll be there, I think helped to make the relationship easier.
I think that's wonderful, in as much as you're also indicating to me that the very nature of just being open is going to be helpful. And I think it's really important in this situation when we're talking about living with a partner who has mental illness, you got to be open about what this is and about what the illness is and about what the condition may present itself as. So I think being open and being out and about talking about the condition is really important to helping not only to live with that person, but also to be of an aid to that person.
So you were talking about boundaries. So how do you define boundaries, Dr. B?
Well, boundaries to me means that I am going to establish a rule for how I'm going to be treated by you. And so boundaries to me means that I am going to model for you how I would like to be treated. And so boundaries become very, very important. They become a way of establishing the norms for how we're going to act with one another. And they're sometimes difficult to establish. But if we don't establish boundaries, then people will often, partners, lovers, significant others, will treat us however they want to.
That's correct. But, one of the things that you're saying, too, is those boundaries have to be verbalized. So I would have to say to someone, well, this is my boundary. I don't want you to call me names or whatever the boundary is, but we make it very clear. We verbalize it.
That's a great point. And I have an example that I use quite often with my patients in regards to establishing boundaries. And it has to do with the way my practice runs, my private practice is operating. And in between, let me just share this with our listeners. In between patients, my receptionist would come in and we call it fluffing the couch, right? And what that just simply means is that she would come in and she would just push the pillows back together and maybe move, there's a blanket on my couch, so she would move the blanket and she would smooth out the wrinkles in the blanket that sits on the cushions of the couch. Now, when she does this, she comes into my office and she's in the office along with myself and no one else. And so the example that I will give people is, what if someday, as she's bending over to fluff the couch, I smack her on her backside and she says nothing to me? Well, what am I thinking after that action? Oh, this is okay. This is our relationship. This is a norm for how we are going to treat one another. And so the establishment of boundaries in my mind is teaching people how to treat you.
So she would say, no way. I'm here to fluff up the pillows and that's it.
Oh, absolutely. And mind you, I never smacked her either. So
good.
Yes. So I knew my boundaries, of course. But the establishment of boundaries really sets the stage for the relationship and how you're going to be treated and how other people want to be treated by you.
Well, and I think when we're living with someone with a mental illness, we also have to be concerned and to know their boundaries, the other person's boundaries, because they will have boundaries as well. So, for example, if they are in a depressed state, they might not want to talk. And they would have to communicate that and let you know so you don't take it personally.
I think communication is really the key to any relationship, obviously, but especially when you're dealing with someone who has a mental illness, right? Because quite often they're suffering internally and they're suffering a lot of times in silence. But it's up to us to draw that out of people and to get people to talk. And people need to be open about what they're going through, because if they're not open about it, then we don't have a clue on how we should respond to them.
So opening up about the mental illness, talking about it, talking about the conditions, certainly, hopefully, will have less stigma for both of you. And then it allows you to really talk about what's needed in the couple and how you can best support each other. Because both of you are going to need support. You, as the partner, are going to be supporting your mate, your partner, in ways that he or she needs.
I think that's a wonderful point, and the communication is really everything. And because that's where you form a game plan for how you're going to proceed in most situations, and how can you be of the most support to one another during this time. Now, you mentioned also that as partners, we're feeling things too, right? And I think it's important to verbalize that as well and to say certain things that are maybe difficult to talk about or to experience. Well, we need to be able to be open about that.
Absolutely. So I have some helpful hints for us today. And the helpful hints, again, are to help you to do better in your relationship. So helpful hints today around living with a partner with mental illness are, number one, inform yourself about your partner's mental illness. Do some research. Find out a little bit about it. Ask your partner, definitely. And two, remember to set clear boundaries for yourself and stick to them. 3, allow your partner to have boundaries and stick to their boundaries as well. 4, take time to discuss your needs and your partner's needs. So opening up communication about what needs to happen. And if needed, seek your own therapy. So besides being supportive of your partner, you're going to seek your own therapy as needed. And we didn't get to mention NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And Dr. Barnes, you want to talk a little bit about NAMI?
Yes, NAMI is a wonderful organization that really is so helpful to both patients and families alike. And they're just a wealth of support and information regarding various mental illnesses. But they also help directly with patients in terms of some training as well. And they have been involved in getting people trained so that they can work within the mental health field. And so NAMI has been just a wonderful source of support for both families and for patients that are suffering from mental illness.
And I just want to point out that NAMI, you can just go nami.org, and you can find out about their resources.
Well, thank you for listening today. And future podcasts, we'll be talking further about some different mental illness conditions and what it might be like living with partners who suffer from these. And as always, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to write in. Thank you for listening. In closing the podcast today, I just want to remind our listeners of our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy. And as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
Thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast. We invite you to submit comments, questions, and/or concerns about today's podcast, or give us feedback on relationship topics you'd like to hear covered. We encourage you to try our helpful hints. Give these a go, try them on for size. Remember, you can follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages under the Crappy Mate podcast. Our website is www.crappymate.com. And please be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.